Hi, third graders. We're still in Unit 1 reading. Remember that our learning targets are identifying the main idea in a passage, supporting details in a passage. You can identify the details that support the main idea. You can continue asking yourself questions to help you understand a text. You can analyze a passage by asking those questions, finding the main idea and the details. You can compare and contrast two selections like we did yesterday. And today's learning target we're going to talk about is I can read and summarize a biography. Remember that a biography is a story written about a person. It is a nonfiction story about a person's life. It is written by somebody else, not their own person. Today, we're going to read a biography on George Washington. You should have this story in your reading packet, so please follow along as I read. Only one person in his Only one person in the history of the United States is known as the father of our country. That person is George Washington. Few people have ever served their country as well as George Washington. He was a soldier, a general, and a leader. He was the first president of a new country. Life in Virginia. George Washington was born on a large farm in Virginia on February 22nd, 1732. As a boy, George loved the open fields and mysterious forests. He liked to hunt and to ride horses. He liked to farm the fertile land of his home. When he was a young man, George became a surveyor. He measured land and made maps. He went deep into the wilderness of Virginia. He camped and learned to take care of himself in dangerous situations. When George was just 21 years old, he became a soldier. He fought with the British against the French. George proved himself to be a strong leader. He earned a promotion to colonel. In 1759, George married. He and his wife Martha settled down to a quiet life. They lived on a spacious farm called Mount Vernon. He filled his days by running the farm, hunting, fishing, and helping to raise Martha's two children. But these happy and peaceful times did not last. Right? I'm just going to pause there and I just want you to think. Here we get an introduction about who George Washington is. So this is like our introduction paragraph. Here we have a little heading that says Life in Virginia. Here we learn about George when he was young and as he grew up in his life. And that's what we learn in biographies about someone's life. So now we have a new heading called the Revolution. So we're going to learn something different. We're not going to be talking about when he grew up. So let's read. By 1775, there were 13 colonies. The people who lived in the colonies followed laws made by the British King, George III. They paid taxes to Britain. The colonists wanted to choose their own leaders and make their own laws. They wanted to make their own decisions about taxes. They wanted their own government. Leaders from the colonies met in Philadelphia to talk about what to do. These leaders made an important decision. They would separate from Britain. They would fight for freedom if they had to. In April 1775, the colonies went to war with Britain. To fight, they had to form an army. They chose George Washington to lead it. He was 43 years old. Leader in war, a new heading. Washington had been a hero in the French and Indian War 20 years earlier. Now he would fight against the British as General George Washington. Few generals have ever faced a greater challenge. The British had the strongest army and the biggest navy in the world. How could 13 small colonies defeat them? The revolution was long and bloody. Most of Washington's soldiers had little training. Washington sometimes had no money to pay them. Supplies were short. It was often hard to get food. How did a small, poorly trained army fight the awesome military power of Britain? They had Washington as their leader. To build a better army, Washington used the skills he developed in the wilderness of Virginia. He taught his men to travel light and to move quickly and quietly. He showed them how to hide in the woods. He made surprise attacks on the enemy. Washington's men loved him and would do anything for him. He did not let them give up, and he did not give up himself. He begged for supplies for his men. He once wrote that the men had, this is a quote, not even the shadow of a blanket to keep warm in the bitter cold. The British had a large army, but the United States had George Washington. All right, here, these tell us about his character traits. He was smart because he's learning his skills, and he is helpful because he's teaching them to other people. Okay? Here it tells us he did not give up. He was determined. Okay, let's keep reading. At first, Washington's army suffered many defeats. Holding his men together was difficult. During the terrible winter of 1777, Washington and his soldiers camped in the icy snow at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Many soldiers had no shoes or warm clothing. They were hungry. Even Washington grew discouraged. Here's what he said. "I am wearied almost to death," he wrote. Many of his soldiers were ready to give up and leave for home, but Washington and his soldiers stayed to fight on. In 1781, after 6 years of fighting, the colonists won their freedom. The United States of America was born. A new leader for a new country. Right, so if you think here, we're done talking about the Revolutionary War. Now we have a new title heading and we're going to talk about something different, him being a leader. Washington said that the only reward he wanted for his hard work was the affection of the free people. He returned to a quiet life at Mount Vernon. He expected to spend the rest of his days there, but again his peaceful farming life did not last. His country was forging a new nation. The country needed a leader with courage and strength. The people wanted someone with a common sense and experience. Washington was the ideal choice. The United States was a new country with a new set of laws. The people had a new way of governing. Instead of having a king, they would vote for a leader. Washington was the man that everyone trusted to get the new government started. Okay, before we go to the next page, think about what you're reading. All of these are his character traits. There's what his personality is like. We could describe him that way. Let's go to our last page about George Washington's biography. Liberty, when it begins to take root, is a plant of rapid growth, he wrote to James Madison in March 1788. Washington won the election and became president of the new nation. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City. It was a cloudless day. Thousands of people lined the narrow streets. They cheered and tossed flower petals. Cannons boomed. Washington placed his hand on a Bible and repeated an oath of office. He promised to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. He was the first person to make this promise. Washington was president for a term of 4 years. Then he served a second term. He proved that a president chosen by the people could be a good leader. He worked to make the new nation strong. During his time in office, 5 new states joined the Union. He made new laws for the new country. He signed treaties or agreements with other countries. He helped the states work together as one government. He kept the nation out of war. All right, let's go to up here, treaties. If we look, this is a word you may not know, but right here they say or agreements. They're giving you a synonym for what treaties mean. A treaty is an agreement. Okay, let's read our last heading. Our title heading says home again. When he left office, Washington returned to his beloved home. After the excitement of war and presidency, he was glad to enjoy the peaceful life of Mount Vernon again. He often told people that he liked to be thought of as the nation's first farmer. He died at Mount Vernon on December 14th, 1799. George Washington was born to a simple, quiet life. He led his country through a long and dangerous war. He guided it through the early years of freedom, and when he died, the following words were spoken about him in a speech delivered before Congress by General Henry Lee. He was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Right. That is a great example of a biography. So remember, when we read biographies, we want to think about summarizing the key events or the important details. We want to think about George Washington. He was our first president. If we look at the title headings, they could help us summarize. He grew up in Virginia, was married. He then had to go and fight in the Revolution. He was the leader in the war. The war went on and on. We finally won a war, and he became our leader for our country. He then was elected as our president, and when he was done with his presidency, he went home again for a quiet life. When we talk about a summary, we want to just talk about the main points. And these headings helped me think about the main things that were happening. In a summary, we don't want to include all the details, just the major points. All right, remember to read today.